Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on India's national broadcaster Doordarshan about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations, and India's contributions to global governance and welfare. Viewers, in this episode, we are taking a close look at the concept of the Indian century, which essentially means India rising to the highest levels in the international order, shaping and defining the rest of this 21st century, and using its values and actions to make a better world order. And to talk about the Indian century, I have with me a very, very appropriate guest, an author, intellectual, public investor, and an economic and financial analyst, Harsh Madhusudan. Harsh Madhusudan is the co-author of this very thought-provoking book called A New Idea of India, along with Rajiv Mantri, and has been writing and talking about the Indian Renaissance in a very deep way. Harsh, it's great to host you on Indian Diplomacy.
Thank you, Sreeram, for having me on your show. It's my honor and pleasure.
Great. Harsh, Indian century is our dream. It is something that we have been aspiring for a long time. But it looks like the current juncture, things are going well for the country as a whole, and that long march to greatness seems to be, very much on track. So, and I want to start with the economy since that is the crux of everything. The World Bank is saying that we are on course for 6.5% annual GDP growth for this current financial year, and that the near-term to medium-term projections are that will continue to grow as the fastest growing major economy in the world. So to start with, that is the ballast that is pushing us forward, isn't it? And I wanted your reflections and thoughts as an observer of the markets and of the economy as to why you think, we have this bullish, approach to the Indian economy and how we can be sure that it will continue going this way despite international headwinds like the trade wars and the American tariffs. India seems to be showing a great deal of robustness and resilience and pluck to keep, surging ahead. So why is that so?
Thank you, Sriram. That's an excellent question. Of course, there are multiple parts to it. One key part is, of course, we are starting from a low base and we have a long demographic and economic runway ahead. The other part, which depends more on our actions, is the kind of policy choices we do. And we've had good reforms and good conservative macro management, both fiscal and monetary, over the last 10, 12 years. So that also gives ballast, especially in uncertain times. And finally, I would simply say that we live in a world where it is very difficult for one part of the world to race ahead with technology and growth compared to the rest of the world, especially if those rest part of the world have good state capacity, as India now does. India had its own sovereign independent state only 75, 80 years ago and has been improving its state capacity, especially if it has human capital. Again, a long way to go, but India has been constantly improving its human capital. So it's not just numbers, it's not just quantity, it's quality as well. Below the age of 25, we have near universal literacy. Most of them are also de facto digital natives. People below the age of 25, everybody has used smartphone, either theirs or their relatives. So this is actually the world's largest youth pool with some skill set, much more to go, all coming online at one point of time when most of the rest of the world, except Africa perhaps, are all seeing the later half of their demographic transition. So they actually are having labor shortages. So in that sense, there is a lot of tailwinds, but it is not destined. It's not written in stone. Our policy choices matter. So I don't want this to sound like a call for complacency. And the policy choices that we've been doing in terms of conservative fiscal and monetary management, we can quibble a bit here and there. Good reforms, tax reforms. So see, we've had tax cuts on the direct taxes, on the corporate taxes, as well as the indirect / GST tax cuts over the last 5-6 years. And since the spending part, the welfare part has become more efficient thanks to digital public infrastructure, UID, Aadhaar, Jam Trinity, whatever you want to call it, the overall state capacity is improving, although there are areas, of course, where we need to improve, for example, urban governance, judicial and police reforms. But I'm very optimistic in due course of time that will happen. And one final point I'll simply say, unlike other economies, we've not yet maxed out on debt as a lever as well. So corporate India is extremely underlevered compared to its own history. The retail India or families of households of India are also relatively underlevered, although real interest rates being high, the cost of servicing can be sometimes higher. So many of these Ds, debt, demographics, demand, digitalization, as our Prime Minister puts it, these are all tailwinds for India, whereas they are headwinds for most of the large economies. But let us not get too ahead of ourselves in the sense that we are still at around $3,000 or less per capita income at market exchange terms, $12,000 or $13,000 in PPP terms. As a point of comparison, the US is at $89,000, right? So I think there is a long march ahead, as you rightly mentioned. We seem to have all the right ingredients in place. And this is something where we should not be too terribly surprised if we get 6-7%. And especially with the right environment, which it is not right now globally, but in the right environment, we should actually be dissatisfied with 6 or 7% and aim for higher single digits growth. But overall, I think this trend, as you rightly insinuated at the beginning, is likely to continue for another 20 years. So basically, we are going to add 200 million people in the age group of 25 to 65 in the next 25 years. China will let go of 100 million people in the age group of 25 to 65, mostly because they'll retire above 65. And the difference of differences is 300 million, which is almost the entire population, man, woman, and child of the United States of America. So these are huge demographic and economic transitions. Africa, for example, is not one united country. It will also do well in the coming decades. But as one nation state, this is unprecedented. And I think it's a good omen for times to come.
Absolutely. So the fundamentals are there. Viewers, Harsh Madhusudan is saying demographic, but also policy transformations and reforms are critical. And I want to go there next. Harsh, lately, given all the the international challenges we are facing with the protectionism and the unpredictability and all that, there is a call by the Narendra Modi government to rely on ourselves more. This Atmanirbhar Bharat or Self-Reliant India is, of course, not a new concept. It started around the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, but as a movement, it is now seen as the main strategy through which we can survive these global cross currents. So the question is, how is this kind of self-reliance that we're talking about today different from the pre-1991 era self-reliance? I mean, in your book, A New Idea of India, you have strongly critiqued the socialist period, which held us back in a big way. So, but it's the word self-reliance, some people argue, harks back to that era of import substitution and autarky and all that, right? But it's different. So one is, how is it different? And secondly, Prime Minister Modi has said that vocal for local and to buy Indian products and services and to choose Indian options does not mean that we are not connected to the global. And he says the second link is, after vocal to local, is local to global. So we have to produce and have the capacities to also sell to the rest of the world and to export more, right? So please talk a bit about these two interconnected phenomena.
Sreeram, that's a very nuanced and excellent question, because you are right. If you look at it from 30,000 feet point of view, I can see, and you can see why some people may confuse these two topics. As you rightly mentioned, what we had pre-1991 can be more rightly defined as autarky. Autarky basically meaning that you are basically having de minimis economic intercourse with the rest of the world. What we today have is not autarky, but a push for autonomy. Autonomy does not in any way let go of the benefits of global trade. In fact, as we speak, the same Prime Minister Modi's government is negotiating epic agreements on trade, bilateral trade agreement with the United States of America, another trade agreement with the European Union, which, by the way, has been going for almost 2 decades. We've just concluded one with the UK. It'll come into force next year. One just came into force with 4 European countries, the EFTA. We already have one with Australia now, with UAE now. We are talking with a few Latin American countries, and we had some pre-existing deals with Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN. So if you think about it, but this sounds very contrarian on the surface of it, right? So we are actually signing and pushing for signing trade agreements right, left, and center while talking about autonomy. So what does that mean? It means that certain strategic capacities have to get an additional push from the government, occasionally in the form of very, very moderate time-bound protectionism, but more in the form of industrial subsidies, for example, production-linked incentives, PLIs, where the aim is to actually get into global supply chains. So all major economies that have grown rich over time have had a combination of trade and autonomy. What the government is effectively saying is do value add in India, you'll be treated absolutely equally, but please, based on your external economies of scale, right? If you have huge car factories in Thailand or China or Germany, don't just dump products here because it helps you with your marginal cost, and effectively deindustrialize India. So there are only two areas where scale economies are so high where we need to be somewhat cognizant and somewhat cautious. One is, of course, the Chinese manufacturing colossus, which is 10x our size. So we are always, of course, given geopolitical realities, although there is a bit of a thaw of late, we will always be a bit cautious. And secondly is US big tech. So US big tech, of course, is another industry, even though we don't see in terms of factories, etc., which has huge network externalities and economies of scale. And we've seen recently the Prime Minister, the Home Minister, various ministers talking about it, pushing, for example, incorporating Zoho Mail, Zoho chat apps like RFI, etc. Exactly. So the idea is, what can we do to tip the scale for our entrepreneurs without being closed? And sometimes, there is an element of learning here. For example, I would myself argue as somebody who in chapter 4 of this book says, free market competition is great, but we need some version of industrial trade policy. I would still argue sometimes you overdo it. For example, QCOs, quality control orders, are sometimes overdone. So there is an element of learning, and this is where good state capacity and the public's broad trust in the executive, at least the higher echelons, is so critical to do this, because in the absence of public trust, this can easily devolve into allegations of cronyism.
Right. Well, so there's a fine balance that you're talking about, and that's of paramount importance. We have to maintain that going forward.
Yes.
Now, Harsh, in this book, the new idea of India, one of the central arguments is also that India is a civilizational republic that is returning to the global high table. And you have actually emphasized the principle of Dharma and said that is the guiding principle of Indian civilization. And you have argued that it is linked to India's rise or return, as a major player in the world. So it will be helpful for our audiences to understand what is the link between culture and heritage and civilization on one hand, and this economic dynamism and the renaissance and the geopolitical ascent that we're talking about. Because you can make a distinction between culture and the economy and the geopolitics, right? But you are actually saying that these are all intrinsically linked, and if there is no cultural renaissance, then there is no question of Bharat or India actually rising in the world again. So it cannot just be purely a mechanical thing like economic growth or military might. And you're talking about the centrality of culture. So let's talk a bit about this.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So, you cannot grow in a purely kind of Cartesian vacuum. There are multiple aspects to it. Of course, it's a very multifaceted question you asked. One, of course, there is an element of just self-belief, right? If you're constantly feeling that you are inferior in some way, despite, and that can actually exhibit externally as puffery or actually supremacism outside and inferiority complex inside, that is fundamentally psychologically at an individual and collective level unhealthy. So there is something just basic about being rooted to your soil and your ancestors. But more broadly, specifically, what is Dharma? So Dharma, of course, Sanatan Dharma, the way I would define it, there are different kinds of Kal-specific Dharma or a particular branch, which is more like, a sect. That is different. I'm talking about the entire umbrella of Sanatan Dharma. It is about religious pluralism. It is about spiritual pluralism. It is saying your understanding of moksha could be different from my understanding of moksha. And you know what? You don't have to follow my way. I don't have to follow your way, so long as we have mutual respect. Not just tolerance, but mutual respect. Now, that is actually, especially in the theological spiritual side, and we've had problems in the social side, but at the same time, there's nothing wrong in our civilization which has not been reformed from within the civilization. So specifically on the spiritual side, that enables fraternity. And if you do not have fraternity, then the whole debate of liberty and equality, a modern nation state, in this case, a civilizational state, falls flat. Because ultimately, what is a modern nation state? We are saying we will disagree on many things, but there is something fundamentally we agree upon, and that's only possible if we have some base level of mutual respect for each other. So, going without being too abstract, West Bengal is in the east of India, it's in India. East Punjab is in the northwest of India, it is in India. But West Punjab and East Bengal are not in India, right?
Yeah.
So there is an element of culture, right? What I would say is civilization. You can share culture. Culture can be skin deep, it can be stomach deep. Civilization, I call it, is soul deep. There is something which brings people together despite ethnic differences. And in that, for India, I would say the right word is dharma. So, of course, we can proxy it in the Indian subcontinent as Hinduism. That is also a neologism, the ism part. But I think a more accurate term is dharma, because it allows different forms of going about your lives possible at a very base level. Without that fraternity, you cannot have liberty, equality. You cannot have a united democratic nation state. And how does that connect to economics in this sense? See, we are going back to an era, and last 300, 400 years was an aberration, especially last 200 years. For most of mankind's history, the largest polities have been the largest economies.
Yeah.
So basically, some societies are a bit more efficient, so 30, 40% more. Some were slightly less efficient, 10, 20% less. But broadly, if you could multiply by the number of people, you would get a rough order of the ranking of the economic size as well. But what happened was, with the great divergence, thanks to technology, but also thanks to colonialism, slavery, etc. So there were both good and bad parts. Europe and its offshoots raced ahead in the last 200, 300 years.
Yeah.
One could argue 500 years, but it really happened in the last 200 years. Now, that is, by economists and historians, it's called the Great Divergence. We are in the early parts of what is known as the Great Convergence. And it is likely in the 2050s or 2060s, we look back at this era and say it was obvious the world's largest polities should be the world's largest economies. And if that is, it will be retrospectively obvious. The question that arises is, why is it that India is the world's largest polity? Right?
It's due to the cultural unity, isn't it?
It is due to that basic civilizational unity. Because European Union also has some cultural unity, but it is finding it difficult to cohere beyond a point. It may eventually, of course. Nothing is written in stone. China has had the history of being a polity for 4,000 or 5,000 years in a way that India does not. India has the history of being a civilization, but not a united polity to the extent China has. In the case of China also, it is exaggerated, and often their empires were not necessarily led by Han Chinese, but by Manchus, etc. Nonetheless, the Chinese have a longer political imagination and history. In our case, the state in this united form is relatively new to us. And the reason this state works, and like I said, Punjabis on both sides of the border, Bengalis on both sides of the border, but these Punjabis and these Bengalis happy to be together, these Kashmiris and these Tamils happy to be together, and people mixing beyond caste and language now. The reason that's possible is because the underlying software, the operating system, if you want to call it, is Dharma. And Dharma in that sense is universal and Sanatan. The Indian version is the subcontinental version. If you have spiritual pluralism in the United States and Europe, that is also dharmic in that sense. So this is civilizational in the subcontinental sense, but it is also civilizational in a universalist humanitarian sense.
Right.
And that fact, building block allows us to have scale for economics.
It reminds me of our External Affairs Minister, Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar, saying there is no contradiction between nationalism and internationalism when it comes to India, because we are able to, see the subtleties and the connections among these.
Dr. Jaishankar, just to quickly add, if I have the permission of yours to just, Dr. Jaishankar is absolutely spot on. But if you read Rabindranath Tagore, if you read Vivekanand, if you read even from Prime Minister Nehru to Prime Minister Modi, in India, nationalism, or for that matter, Jayaprakash Narayan, the wonderful speech of his in the 1970s, all great Indian leaders have always said that there is no inherent contradiction between Indian nationalism and universalist internationalism. So I fully agree with the point you mentioned.
And that is because of the foundational principle of Dharma. Right.
Absolutely.
Harsh, you have been saying that social attitudes also matter for this Indian century and for India to rise to the number one position in the world. You have said that we need to have a generational aim to be number one.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
you've talked about the need for self-belief among our society. And the government has set its own goals for the centenary 2047, Viksit Bharat, leading power, and so on. But the question is Indian society, in your view, especially the younger generation, the demographic bulge you're talking about, ambitious enough, for these kind of targets? Is it buckled up to strive to achieve these targets? Sometimes, when leaders and politicians talk about it, many people are cynical and they seem to be not so worried about propelling the country forward so much, as a whole. So this self-belief, how can we instill in it, and the drive, to be number one? You said the Chinese have had it, the Americans have had it in the past, and that's how they rose, right? It's not just the numbers game of GDP or even cultural values. It is something that is in the current generation, and the coming generations must have to strive for, right? So how do we instill this in the society, and what signs are you seeing that we are actually have the DNA to be number one?
No, Sreeram, thank you once again for an excellent question. You're absolutely right. It has to be in the zeitgeist. It has to be the result of a determined elite. So the tailwinds are very much there, as I mentioned. But again, that cannot be taken as a call for complacency. So let me first, before just going into how the numbers add up, one quick point. See, the US is around 7.5 times India's per capita income if you adjust for cost of living. So I don't want to get too technical for the viewers. It's called PPP. But the point is, if India just grows 6% faster than the US for the next 34, 35 years, we will not just overtake the US in economic size, we will overtake the US in per capita income size as well. And if you do that for 5%, maybe over 40 years. So the first and foremost important thing to understand is it is doable. That's number one. Often we get confused because we see the market exchange rates and then we try to do some linear extrapolation mathematically. But again, without getting into the economic jargon of it, it is eminently doable. That's number one. Number two, it is eminently desirable. There is a huge chip on the shoulders of the Indian elites, especially the older ones, where, without taking names, a famous author said, India should not strive to be a superpower. See, the point, you may not strive to be a superpower, but then you are bending to the will beyond the point of some other superpower. So this idea that we are, this element of inferiority complex, or rather imposter syndrome, is very much there in the older sections of the Indian elite. You mentioned about the youth. Based on my, and I'm the first person to concede it is anecdotal, but when I look at people in their teens, in their 20s, in their early 30s, they are much less burdened by a scarcity complex. Their aspirations are sky high, and their sense of self-belief and confidence is at another level. Again, there is an entire bell curve like there is in any other society, country, or civilization. So there are all kinds of people amongst the younger generation as well. But the average quality of the better trained, better working people within the younger generation is much better than my cohort, which is, I would say, better than the previous cohort 10 years earlier, and so on and so forth. Right. So there is a clear improvement. And see, again, it comes back to our values. We are not, what happens when India becomes very strong? If India becomes very strong, we are likely to make the world more pluralist.
Right.
We are not likely to say, you must do only this, you must believe only this, otherwise you are damned for eternity, or at least in this world.
It's a non-hegemonic rise, and that's a viewer's very important point Harsh Madhusudan is saying, because inherently, civilizationally, we've always believed in this pluralism, or what we called a multipolar order, and we have not been in favor of domination of any one power. Last word, Harsh, quick word, we are almost out of time. What are the obstacles and the risks going forward? I mean, we've spoken about a lot of the positive trends in the country, but even internationally, I mean, existing great powers do not usually exceed or concede when a wannabe comes up to their level. And historically, I mean, both the Chinese and in a different way, the Americans may not be so happy with India's rise. So how do we deal with these headwinds which are international in your view?
No, absolutely, you're right. I mean, I think even the Americans beyond a point will not be very happy. And we are seeing early signs of that because they've seen how powerful the Chinese have become, and they don't want a repeat of that. It may not entirely be in their hands, of course. Which brings me to the last quick point. The real obstacles, if any, at the end of the day will be internal and not external. And I strongly believe, you see, when the Prime Minister takes an oath in Hindi, the word used for the Republic is Sangha, which effectively means and calls attention to Sanghatan or organization. Dharma's strength is pluralism, but Dharma's historical weakness was lack of organization, because we did not ever want to other anybody else. And all organization involves an in-group and an out-group. So the nation state gives us what we lacked otherwise in terms of organization. So making sure that we are very careful in how we speak, what we do. We do not in any way, alienate people based on caste, on language, on religion, and we get together and we take this country forward. If we just keep this country united and we have sensible policies, nothing fantastic, although more better the more welcome it is, I have no doubt that we will be the world's largest economy and not just the largest polity by the middle of the century.
Right. Viewers, a fascinating discussion with Harsh Madhusudan, and he has highlighted many fundamentals which are strong and which are propelling Bharat or India to its destined place under the sun. But he has also flagged some risks, and it is worth focusing on the question of unity, on the question of purpose, on the question of self-belief. And this is what, these are the intangibles. It's not just about, going forward with a semiconductor mission or with, dazzling infrastructure. All those, of course, are physical attributes of India's rise. But the socio-cultural and the spiritual attributes are also equally important, because without that spirit or the zeitgeist, as Harsh Madhusudan was saying, it will be difficult for a nation to remain united, to remain that big polity, and to restore its grandeur and glory. Thank you, Harsh. It's great to have you, and please continue to ideate for the rise of India.
Yes. Thank you so much, Sreeram, for having me on your show once again. Thank you.
Viewers, the Indian century is underway. That's all we can say for the moment. It is work in progress. There are, miles to go before we sleep. But with the right kind of attitudes, behaviors, and capabilities and policies to back up India's rise, we are reasonably confident by mid-century and beyond, India will be the leading power in the world. And Indian ideas, Indian values, Indian interests will be reflected in shaping the international order. Let us work towards that. For Indians, my appeal is that let's join this national movement to be a leading power and a Viksit Bharat or a developed India. And for the friends of India all over the world who support us, we will need your continued backing going forward. Thank you for watching. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.